Hi everyone. Today I want to go over my method of working with ACES in After Effects. So let's jump in. Okay, here we are in Cinema 4D, and right off the bat I do want to say that I'm not going to be going into the very detailed description of ACES itself. There are a lot of tutorials online that cover the basics and some of the terminology used and some use cases for it. And I have a selected few of those linked in the video description. So if you're new to ACES, definitely check those out. I think they do a good job of laying down a good foundation to understand some of the complexities of this whole system. If you are brand new to ACES, there are a couple things you will need to download in order to get started. One of them is the OpenColorIO plugin for After Effects, and there's a link to that down in the description as well. You'll need this along with the actual ACES OCIO config file. There's a link to that down in the description as well. So I've got both of these things already installed, and I'm not going to run through the installation procedure. Check out the links down below for that as well. Okay, back to Cinema. So this is a scene I've been using to sort of play around with getting an ACES workflow going, and it's pretty basic. I've got an infinite light along with a spotlight that I'm using only to cast caustics through this glass here. If you have questions about that, I do have a caustics tutorial that covers that in much greater detail. As far as the textures and materials in the scene, I'm not using any sort of color textures. Any color in the scene is coming from a color I chose in the material. So like the diffuse color, like background, basic background material, all have the color selected here. There are no textures. So basically, I'm not utilizing any color textures that need to be transformed into ACES. I'm making those decisions as I'm rendering. So I hit the play button here and start to render my scene. So we can take a look here, and I want to open up these settings. And right now we're in the display mode sRGB. So I want to change that over to the OCIO ACES. So I'm going to select OCIO, and I don't have the OCIO config set up as an environment variable where this is automatically selected. So I do have to go and select it each time. So I have this here, and I'll go and select where I installed my OCIO color configs. And I will just hit open, and now that config file is loaded up and the view transform is set to sRGB ACES. So I'm going to stay within sRGB ACES for this whole run through, but this could just as easily be Rec 709 or P3, whatever you're working in. My monitor is calibrated to sRGB, so that's what I'm going to use. If your monitor is calibrated to Rec 709, you can use that with pretty much no change in the workflow. Okay, so right off the bat, we're getting an image that looks okay. So I've already selected these colors based on this view transform. So that's how I've gone in and selected my background color, for instance. So I changed this. I'm like, okay, hey, maybe this could be a little bit more saturated, so I can bring the saturation up on this. And I'm seeing the results here. I'm going to undo that. So that's how I've made my creative decisions. And this is how I'd work normally. I would choose my colors based on what I think looks good in the scene. So once I have this view transform selected, I'm now seeing these colors as though they're in the ACES color space. So we're now working with in that wide gamut of color. And so that's one of the aspects of ACES that's so appealing, is that you get to utilize a very wide gamut of colors. So the ACES color space that we're sort of moving into, now right now we're using ACEScg, which is a very wide color space as well. But the ACES color space itself, ACES 2065, what it's called, encompasses all the colors the human eye can see. So that's sort of the beauty of this, that once you're transformed into the ACES color space, we've future-proofed our render. So if a new state-of-the-art display comes along that can display every color the human eye can see, then all we'd have to do is take our render, and instead of using the sRGB output display transform, we would use this new display's output display transform, and we're all set. The other benefit to ACES is that we get this automatic tone mapping, and we're able to take a very high dynamic range image and squish it down and make it fit into our standard dynamic range displays. So I think there's a lot of talk about ACES being used, especially for comping CG into live action footage. And that's definitely a huge benefit to using ACES, where your CG footage is going to look great going from ACEScg comped into footage that's been converted to ACES. But I think everyone could take advantage of ACES to get better looking renders, not just those that are comping into live action footage. And I think that really comes down to how well ACES deals with not only color, but tone mapping such a high dynamic range. ACES itself, I believe, has a capability of storing like 30 stops of dynamic range, which is a huge amount of data. So those brights are super, super bright, and it's able to store all that luminance data and then squish it all down so it's displayed on the appropriate display. And so let me, for an example here, when I talk about tone mapping, let me kind of show you what I mean. So let me stop this for a second. Let me hop over into Lightroom. We've got bright sun shining up against a really light wall and light floor. So as you can see, I've made a few exposures to kind of prove my point here. And so in a similar way that our monitors are only able to display so much in color and light information, right now anyway, I don't have a high dynamic range monitor. So my monitor is just an sRGB monitor. And similarly, my camera can only take in so much light information and color information at a time. So in this scene, I need to decide what I want to expose for. And ideally, I would have a nice mix. I would have bright highlights that aren't blown out and unclipped shadows that aren't going completely to black, but there's still data there. And so if I was going to decide, I would probably pick this image. So this would be, if I only had one shot at it and I had to expose for it, I would say, okay, I'm going to shoot it at this exposure because I'm just starting to clip my shadows and I have clipped highlights here, but they're not extreme. They're not as extreme as this one here. So I've picked this sort of middle ground. Now I have shot this in RAW, and basically that means I'd have more latitude than I would if I had a JPEG. If this was just a JPEG image, this is it. Changing the exposure would, this would stay bright, or if I drop the exposure down, it would just turn gray. But because this is RAW, I kind of have this little high dynamic range image that I'm able to adjust. So I can take the highlights down. You can see I'm starting to pull back these details because I've shot this in RAW. So now I'm not blowing out these highlights. You can see the shadows of the chair came back and they're not being eaten away. So this is before. Let me turn off the clipping. So you can see this sort of getting lost in here. There's not a lot of detail, but if I pull this down, you can see much more of the wall color coming through, and these shadows are much more defined. And I can do the same thing for the shadows. I can start to lift the shadow slider up until we're getting something like this. And this is sort of more like what my eyes saw. My eyes were able to see much more detail here in the shadows. This wall was glowing from the reflection of the light coming in off the floor. And so I can push this a little bit. I mean, probably somewhere around there. The problem is, this is only one image and I don't have that much latitude. My camera, it's an okay camera, but it doesn't have the dynamic range that this scene would really require. So as I'm pushing this up, I don't know if you can see this on the screen capture, but I'm getting a lot more noise now in my image. So that's the problem with doing this. There's only so much information, but I have to decide what I want to expose for. Now, I do have these 4 exposures that I could say, okay, hey, Lightroom, take all of these and photo merge, make an HDR with it. The same way we would do a high dynamic range HDR image to LiDAR CG scenes. It's the same process. So we take all those and combine them, and I have that here. And that is now looking much more natural. This is much closer to the way I saw this scene in real life. And I'm not clipping any of the shadows up here, and this wall is being illuminated with light bouncing up and around. Now, if you notice over here, I have made adjustments to this. I've sort of tone mapped this high dynamic range image to suit my sRGB display. This is falling, all of these values are now falling well within the range my monitor can display, and it looks good. But without these adjustments, if I turn these off, Go back to how this was before I did any adjustments. You can see it's kind of the same thing. The highlights are blown out here. Shadows are clipped. We're kind of losing the detail. But it's the same problem. The data's there. It has all this data, but there's only so much the display can handle. So that tone mapping, we sort of bring these things down, the highlights down, the shadows up, the contrast. We do all these things selectively to get the image we're after. And that's the same thing that's happening here with ACES. ACES does this in a very sophisticated way where it's taking all of this color data and all of this luminance data and moving it around and finessing it in order to fit the display we select here. So our view transform is set to sRGB, and so it's taking all this data and moving it around in order to display it on our sRGB display. So that's what it is. It's like this subjective tone mapping and color mapping system that brings our high dynamic range data down into something our display can handle. So in this scene, I have an infinite light shining down through some light blockers up above. But I've got the infinite light set pretty high. The intensity multiplier is set up to 15, and I'm utilizing ACES in order to bring this bright sunlit scene down into the range that my display can handle. So I take this off. If I go back from OCIO back to sRGB, you can see how blown out my scene is. So we're losing all this information. So normally what I would be doing is taking this would be way lower. This wouldn't be up to 15. It would probably be closer to 1. Let's see what it would be. Maybe 4, maybe 5. So maybe somewhere around there, because I feel like right in here we're starting to blow out some of the highlights in this white eraser here. So if I look over at the pixel value of these, yeah, so these are now all pure white. So that's about the highest I can go without starting to remove information from my image. You can see what a difference this is. So this is only a third of the brightness. So I'm firing a third less energy into the scene if I'm utilizing just the standard sRGB display. But with ACES, I'm not limited to just a low dynamic range scene. I can crank this up to be closer to what sunlight would be. And even with this up to 15, you can see here, we're not losing this information. I can still see the edge of this eraser. And this comes into play especially when I turn on caustics. So I do have caustics in the scene. So that's a great example of where light's being refracted and sort of collected into these sharp points. And it's very easy for that bright caustic pattern to blow out and to lose detail. So it's that balancing act of like, okay, you bring your caustic levels down in your light and then up the exposure. But really what I was doing in the past was just trying to fit my lighting in my scene to a low dynamic range or a standard dynamic range lighting. And that makes sense if we're talking about studio lighting, because that's really what we're doing in real life anyway. We're adjusting the lights of our strobes, our studio strobes, to fit the camera exposure. But in situations where you're mimicking sunlight, we're not doing that. We're taking a photo of an interior space that's lit by the bright sun. So in situations like this, normally what I would be doing in the past, I would be doing is turning the sun into a low dynamic range light source, a much dimmer sun. So we're getting less bounces around our scene. We're kind of doing a physically incorrect lighting scenario in that case. So this is sort of an interesting way of making sure that we're lighting our scene correctly and using the correct values. We're not limited to a low dynamic range image. Now we're utilizing ACES tone mapping in order to squeeze all this data down. And personally, I think it does it in such a nice way. From what I found, I get really pretty good looking renders with only a little bit of tweaking needed in post. So now I want to go over the workflow that I use for getting images rendered out of Cinema 4D and how I set up ACES in After Effects. So right now we have our OCIO display mode set in the Redshift render view, and we had the view transform set to sRGB. I've got bloom and streak checked on. I'm going to leave those on. The only thing I'm going to do when I render this is come up into my Redshift post effects under color management. I'm just going to uncheck enabled. So right now, this brings our image. Let me hit render here. This is going to bring our image back into just linear gamma. So we're not doing the nice tone curve of ACES, and you can see this is all blown out. So this is now being rendered out without any Redshift color management being applied. This is now just a linear gamma render. So when I save this as an EXR, I have this set to 16 bits per channel depth, but I have used 16-bit float. So we're still getting all that data. We're just not having the huge file size of 32-bit images. So it helps keep the file size down. And to be honest, I usually just pick one of these zip compressions. I haven't had any issues with it. I think Chad Ashley has a tutorial going through what some of these, the differences in some of these. I think RLE, run length encoding, was the smallest file size. So if file size is an issue, you may want to look into this. But once that's ready, I can render this out. So I want to show you, if I don't turn that off, if I render this out with color management enabled and this view transform applied, what we get is something that looks great. So if I go over to After Effects here, see here's my render, and I have this rendered out. So I have this as an EXR, 16-bit float, so it's still 32-bit project file, and it looks like it did in the render view. But I have a exposure applied to this. Let me just reset that to 0. So this is what our render looked like coming out of Cinema. But if I do an exposure adjustment here and I bring this exposure down, you can see the highlights are just going to gray. And if I raise it up, they're just blowing out to white. So even though this is an EXR, that color management view transform is basically like a LUT that was applied at render time that is clamping our values. So now we don't have all this extra highlight data. It's just been stopped at 1. So now when we go and do our exposure adjustment, we're just blowing everything out. It's all obliterated. No extra data in there, even though we've saved it out as an EXR. So if we go back, let me just turn this off. If we go back into Cinema and then turn this off and then render this out. So I go back over into After Effects and come over here. Here is the EXI rendered out with color management off. And we get that sort of blown out look. So we need to bring this back into the ACES color space. So I guess I'll just do this from scratch right now and make some new layers. Let me just hide this layer for now. It's going to be a comparison for later, but I'm just going to delete these two and walk through how I would do this. So we need to add another adjustment layer, and I'm going to call this OCIO ACEScg to sRGB. And I'm going to apply the OCIO, I guess, OpenColor OCIO plugin. Now it's the same thing here as it is in Cinema for me, where I don't have this set up to automatically just fill in the config file. I have to go search for it each time. So I have a space for it. I've just saved it into my presets and config OCIO. So this comes in with an input space of ACES 2065, which is the super wide gamut standard ACES color space. Now our view transform we were using in Cinema was ACEScg to sRGB. So we need to go from ACEScg to sRGB, just like Redshift was doing with the view transform. This looks close. It looks a little washed out though. It looks like a gamma problem. And if we come up here, if I go to View, Use Display Color Management, if I turn that off, it looks correct. This is the image we're expecting to see. So I want to talk a little bit about this, Use Display Color Management. This is where this gets to be kind of confusing, and there are some workflows for utilizing ACES within After Effects, and a lot of them on YouTube center around the idea of turning all of After Effects' color management off and utilizing only the OCIO plugin to do the color management. And that works great. However, in my opinion, it's so complicated because we have to turn off color management in like 4 locations in order to get what we want from import to export. So this is the kind of the reason for this tutorial is I found a way to utilize After Effects' color management and still get a proper ACES workflow. So just very quickly, I'm going to go over the method that's been passed around and the standard method that you find on YouTube for utilizing ACES within After Effects. And that involves going up to your project settings, changing color. Instead of sRGB or Rec 709, what you normally do, you change it to ACES and ACEScg, and you then have to make sure Linearize Working Space is selected. We want to make sure that's linearized. You have to go over any footage that you bring in. You have to go interpret footage, main, up to color management, and then preserve RGB. Basically, color management is off. And that way that is interpreted correctly without After Effects taking over. Then we need to make sure in our comp, use display color management is off. Then we have to go, when we export this, we want to export this frame. If I go save frame as file, under the file type, we need to make sure color management, this is set to preserve RGB. I realized when I was editing this, I went through that workflow very quickly and thought maybe this needed a little bit more explanation. So I have the steps here typed out. I also have all of this pasted in the description below. So if you did want to explore this option, these are the steps you'd have to take. Hope that helps. So there's all these steps that have to be taken, and I don't know if you're anything like me, I always forget one. And then I'm exporting, especially multiple clips, multiple places. You have to do this for everything. And so I was making some mistakes here, and I thought, is there a better way to do this where I can see it? So I like the node system of DaVinci Resolve. That's great because you can see one thing after another. And the layers in After Effects, it's great because I can see what layers are above and I know it's being applied to everything below it. So that's sort of my process here. So I'm going to reset all this stuff and go back to default. So, we are sRGB, great. So now we need to talk about display color management. So right now, this only looks correct if I have used display color management off. With it on, it looks washed out, right? So let's turn this off and do a test here. So if I go up and I do save frame as file and just do, let me get rid of this, just as a JPEG. Okay, so if I bring this over and see, you can see, even though I've got display color management off, we're still seeing the effect as though it was turned on. So what's happening here? So we're utilizing OCIO in order to do our color management, and we're saying output sRGB. So sRGB has a gamma curve associated with it. Now, sRGB in itself is the color space, but there's an sRGB gamma curve or a transfer function that's associated with that in order to display sRGB images correctly. And since we have our output set to sRGB, that gamma curve is being applied to our linear EXR because we're transferring this linear ACEScg file into sRGB color space and also sRGB gamma. But After Effects doesn't know we're doing any of that because this is just a plugin. After Effects is like, oh, hey, buddy, I got you. You are displaying your image here on an sRGB monitor. You're going to need a gamma curve. So now we have 2 sRGB gamma curves applied. So if we take this off, we're removing one of those gamma curves and it looks correct. But with it on, we've got 2 gamma curves, so it's washed out. And so we have a couple options here. We can either go back to that other workflow where when we export, we go back to, okay, we could say, hey, let's save frame as file and go back to color management and do preserve RGB. But this, I don't want to do that because I always forget. So instead, let's add a new layer. And we're going to call this sRGB Gamma Fix. Okay, And then we're going to apply Color Profile Converter. In our Color Profile Converter, we're going to set the input profile to sRGB. We're going to set the output profile to sRGB. We want to stay in sRGB, but we have the option to select Linearize Output Profile. If we click on that, we're now applying the inverse curve from sRGB in order to linearize the sRGB. But we're not really linearizing it anymore, right? Because we knew there was 2 gamma curves applied. So we're just removing one of them. And now we're back to what we'd expect. So now with this layer on, we can export as normal. So we're going OCIO, ACEScg to output sRGB. And to correct for After Effects' color management, we're just going to do an inverse transfer function or gamma curve to bring our double sRGB gamma back down to just 1. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it's confusing, and it took me a while to get my mind around all of these things like gamma curves, transfer functions. But I have some tutorials linked down below that do a great job of explaining this. So I have those down in the description. So definitely check those out. And these people do a great job of running through the more technical aspects of this. So we're now back to what we'd expect to see. We're now back to our normal looking render. But the beauty of this is that I can then add another color correction layer and, for instance, do an exposure. And I can adjust the exposure now. We can see it's much different than what we were getting before, where everything was just going to gray. And if I increase the exposure, you can see we're still keeping this data in here. We're not losing all of this stuff. I can still see the edge of these erasers. And we're up over a stop above. Here's before, here's after. And this is now reacting much more like we would be exposing for film. We have this high dynamic range EXR, and now we're not just sliding the exposure left and right. We're utilizing the ACES tone mapping here. So this is different than, just increasing the exposure on our image. I'm just using the display exposure as an example, but because we're doing this transform, we're doing this exposure adjustment before we're going into ACES and before we're transforming this into sRGB space, we're now feeding a brighter image into ACES. And ACES is saying, okay, cool, I'm still going to take that and squish it all down into something that's viewable in sRGB. So to me, this is just so incredibly powerful that we're able to make such accurate exposure adjustments after the fact and still have access to such a wide range of colors. If I add another, like a hue and saturation, and now this a little bit goes a long way because now we're in ACES color space. So I start to crank up the saturation. You can see how kind of rich these colors are getting, but we're still not clipping any colors. There's still nice gradations between these colors, and we're still getting this nice fall off along the edge of the shadow into the highlights. So it's super powerful. And this can be done, I'm doing this over the whole image, but I could be selectively just, with object buffers or like CryptoMatte or something, just selecting per object and bumping up the exposure or changing the color or the saturation. We have all that leeway now, and now we're color correcting and doing exposure adjustments within the ACES color space. So I want to go over another aspect here that I think is causing some confusion, and it caused a lot of confusion for me. So I have another scene here that I rendered out when I was doing some tests, and this is just some colored lights. Actually, I think I have it open in Cinema. So if I do a quick test render here, I can show you what my scene looks like. And basically I've just got, I need to turn on ACES. So before I do, actually, this is kind of nice. So this is what the scene would look like with the current light intensities if I just left this as the standard sRGB space. So obviously this is way blown out. Like we're losing all this information, and I would have to lower my light intensity in order to get a usable image out of this. But let's go over to ACES. And already you can see the difference. Now, there doesn't seem to be any information loss. We're just seeing we're still seeing a bright image, but we're not getting the clipping that we were getting before because ACES is doing all that tone mapping and pulling all those highlights down into a range that our sRGB monitor can handle. So originally there's talk about how Cinema 4D and Redshift don't natively handle ACES. So you can't do ACES in Cinema 4D. You have to do these workarounds. In cases like this, I do have an HDRI in this scene that I have not converted to ACEScg. These are just, all my materials here are just how I would normally do it. And all I'm doing now is utilizing ACES in a way that is to my creative taste. I'm not utilizing this as like a pure ACES workflow. And I think this has been dubbed like fake ACES, where, yeah, you're getting the benefit of the tone mapping and the color range, but you're not bound by very color specific guides that you have to follow, if that makes sense. Like I'm not doing this to match a scene. I'm not putting this into live action footage. I don't have to match any colors from a client. These are all just my own color choices based on what I think looks good. So I can still use ACES here because I'm the one making the rules. So I say, okay, fine. My dome light has this HDRI in it, and I don't mind the colors of it. It looks fine. Like I don't care what this is. I can zoom out and like, okay, I can see that, like, yeah, the colors look probably more vibrant than they normally would. But I don't care. That's fine. It looks fine to me. So that's sort of like fake ACES, where I don't necessarily have to convert my dome light to ACES in order to get a pleasing image. If I'm just doing dailies or doing something for Instagram, then hey, if it looks good. And also we do have the option of a saturation slider here. If it was too much, bring this down. I mean, you're not transforming it into ACES. It's still not correct, but we still have control over how this looks. So I would say go in and experiment with this without getting caught up too early on like transforming all of your textures and HDRIs into the ACES workflow. We'll go over that a little bit later, but I think to play around with it, you still can get really interesting results and beautiful results without doing the full rigid ACES workflow. But one of the things, back to my point, I guess, is one of the things that was sort of confusing was that because Cinema 4D doesn't have this ACES workflow built in, that there was somehow like you were bound to sRGB. So when you render something out, you're rendering it in sRGB. So I've made all my choices here with this ACES view transform on. And I'm like, okay, I'm happy with this yellow. I'm happy with this blue. I'm happy with these lights. So originally I was like, okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop this and head on over into After Effects. And I've rendered this out. So I've got my fake ACES on here, and my thinking was that, okay, so we need to transform this image from linear sRGB because it's an EXR, and I think that Cinema 4D has some sort of sRGB color baked in. So I need to go from linear, so I've got this, the input space here from utility, linear sRGB, and I want to go to ACEScg. And then I would do my color correction and things like that. And then I have another layer where I go ACEScg to output sRGB. So I turn that on. And then of course we need to fix our gamma, and that's with our color profile converter, sRGB to sRGB, but linearize the output. And you can see immediately that this looks incorrect. This looks really washed out and not what we saw in our render view. If we go back, hit render again. Yeah, the colors are much more vibrant. So maybe our input space is incorrect. So instead of utility linear sRGB, I found that utility raw was correct. Now this is what I expect. This is the image that was matching what I was getting in Cinema 4D. But what's interesting is that utility raw to ACEScg is not doing anything. That's like basically the same thing. So I can turn this off and there's no difference. And so that was sort of confusing to me because I was under the impression from discussions that were happening online, and it's possible that I misinterpreted them, but it seemed like the discussion was that inherently Cinema was doing something that you had to fix later, like with ACES. Like, yeah, it was baking in sRGB colors, and you had to, like, oh, it doesn't really work. But we can keep this off completely, and we can go directly from ACEScg to output sRGB. So we're rendering when we're in Cinema 4D, as long as we turn color management off in our Redshift post effects, as soon as this turns off, we're back to linear gamma, and the colors are going to be fine because we've selected our RGB colors based on the way they look in ACEScg. So everything's fine. We can totally utilize this. So we're now in our ACEScg color space, and we just have to fix the gamma for sRGB, and we're back to utilizing ACES in Cinema 4D and After Effects. Now I have a color correct here with exposure on it and some hue and saturation. I can get rid of the hue and saturation, but as an example, you can see just the huge dynamic range that I'm left with this render. We can go down and see the, these primary colors that I've chosen for the colored lights. And that's, -5 stops. I increase these. We see this natural desaturation of the highlights. This red is getting much less saturated, and we can go all the way up till it's like a bright whitish light. But we're still not really losing a lot of detail here. We're not really clipping anything. Everything's just getting brighter, and we're still sort of squashing all this information down into something that fits into sRGB. And to me, in such a beautiful film-like way. So doing this is just getting really excited about how much light you can bring into a scene and still utilize this sort of high dynamic range data in such a nice fall off. These like highlights are rolling off in such a nice way. So that's a stop overexposed into a scene that was already overexposed. So, so maybe like a stop and a half is where maybe like a normal exposure for this scene would be. But I'd also like to point out, I've left post effects on. I've left bloom on and streak. And if I increase the exposure, I don't know if you saw it, but here's the bloom, here are the streaks getting more and more pronounced as I'm increasing the exposure. So you can leave some of those on. They don't have to be turned off. It's fine. They're not clamping the data. So I've seen that as well. Like, oh, you have to turn off bloom, you have to turn off streaks. And I think part of the confusion is that this color management tab and like color controls and exposure, these would have to be off. The LUT would have to be off. Color management, LUT, color controls, exposure are going to clamp these values. So we'll no longer be in this high dynamic range EXR. We're back to, where is it? Yeah, we're back to this EXR where we have the color management on and we have an exposure setting. We're going to be clamped. We're not going to have the same nice ability to adjust the exposure like we had with this one. Yeah, much different effect. So bloom, flare, streak, those can stay on. I believe that color management, I know color management needs to be off. LUT, color controls, and exposure also need to be off because these clamp that data. So hopefully that clears up some things. I've seen a lot of misinformation on this topic, so hopefully that makes sense. So I also wanted to mention, I probably saw this here, that this also works with a multi-pass workflow, that we can bring in all of our passes and build them. So I've got the diffuse, GI, reflection, refraction, subsurface, specular lighting, caustics, all being built back up, just added together, along with post effects. I've made a post effects layer here by, if I double click on this. So I'm utilizing the RGB pass and the beauty pass. Let me just bring the exposure down just so we can see this here. This is just my view exposure. So my RGB pass in the multi-pass output is my render without post effects applied. Let me put this back to normal. And my beauty pass, oh, excuse me, I had that backwards. So the RGB pass out of Cinema includes the post effects. So if I bring this, so I bring beauty pass on, you can see how this gets a little bit less intense. It's a little dimmer. So the beauty has no post effects applied, RGB has the post effects applied. If I bring the beauty on top of the RGB and set the transfer mode to difference and reset this, the difference is now our post effect pass. So since we've automatically get the beauty and the RGB pass, one without the post effects and one with, we can just say, okay, hey, take the difference and then add that difference back on top of our render without post effects. Hope that makes sense. So now I've pre-comped these, have this set to difference, and now I'm putting it back on top. So now post effects is set on top to add. We have our ACEScg to output sRGB. Let me turn this off. So now we're going from ACEScg to sRGB, and then we're fixing our sRGB gamma, and now we're back to our render. And the beauty of this is that now we still have the ability to go in and, adjust each of these layers if we wanted to, less reflections, or we want super reflections. I can duplicate this and it's still set to add. So, before, after, we can up our reflections. And the same thing with post effects. If I didn't want post effects on anymore, I can take the intensity down. Or if I wanted more post effects, I could duplicate the layer. So there's a ton of control with still utilizing all of the same workflows that we have in the past just by adding a couple layers on top. We're going from ACES back to sRGB and we're fine. I also wanted to point out, I guess for the skeptics out there that are saying, hey, this is incorrect, there's something fishy about this, we can't trust After Effects' color management. I have a TIFF here that I did the exact same thing with all of the settings set to the sort of quote standard way of turning all color management off. So I've got this After Effects export where I've used ACEScg Working Space with Preserve RGB on for all my imports and Preserve RGB on when I exported this as a TIFF. So if I turn this on, there's no difference. And I can test that there's no difference by changing the transfer mode to difference. And if we look up here at our RGB value, all of this is black. So this is nulling out. There's no difference between the two. So the workflows in this case are the same output. But for me, I find this to be a much easier workflow because I don't have to remember to do anything special. I'm just importing this footage. I don't have to do anything different in interpreting the footage. The color space is my default sRGB. My use display color management default is on, and exporting these is just as simple as exporting. I can go to JPEG. I can leave this as default. Don't have to do anything in color management. Okay. And bring this over, and it's the same. So no extra steps to forget, which is important for me because I was always forgetting something and I would discover it way too late after I'd sent files off, or some of them looked okay, some of them didn't, and I had to figure out which ones were right, which ones were wrong. So this seemed to simplify things a lot for me. So I don't have to go in and do anything special with unticking boxes or clicking boxes. It is all just handled right here with a gamma correction layer, color profile converter. Just a quick note, a couple other things I did test out. I was wondering if JPEGs saved from the render view, go back into Cinema and show you, if the JPEGs saved from this render view, if I did a file save image as, were different than ones that were sent to the picture viewer to render. If I rendered this out to the picture viewer, would this be the same? And what I found was, yes, there's no difference here in the way to output these. So that wasn't a variable. Like, oh, you could only save images out of the render view. Like Cinema 4D does something different with files saved to the picture viewer or rendered out through the picture viewer. I found none of that. So they were the same. If I set this to difference, you only see the JPEG artifacts. They are the same. If I had done 16-bit TIFFs, there'd be no difference. Another thing, so I have a couple examples here where this is my ACES workflow just straight out of Cinema 4D, and I wanted to do a comparison with trying to do the same looking image without utilizing ACES. If I was still back in sRGB, how I would expose the scene and what I would normally be dealing with. So before I ventured into ACES, I'd be using just the standard RGB workflow, and so I would have to use different values for my lights and different values for colors and things like that. So I've tried to replicate that here, what I would normally be doing, but you can see the issues here where the caustics are really blown out here. Same here and here is sort of the reflections, and this is what I was showing earlier where the front of these erasers were starting to get blown out, and I don't really see any difference between the edge of the eraser and the top. And overall, this is sort of an unnatural look to it, and I wouldn't really know that until I look at the alternative, where this seems to be much more natural. There's like the difference between the highlights and the shadows is much softer, and we can see here now there's so much more detail in these caustics and areas where light is being concentrated or magnified. And that's been a problem for me where, you have to adjust your caustics exposures down to get all these fine details, especially if you're doing something very caustics heavy. You sort of run out of room. Since you're dealing with light, you're going to blow out those highlights unless you're exposing your scene only for the caustics. And I've gotten a couple questions on the caustics tutorial, like how do I not blow these out? And because you're talking about light, it's a difficult thing to answer because, okay, you could either lower the intensity of the caustics themselves, lower the intensity of the light, but then your scene lighting changes. So you're back to that, photography problem of picking the exposure you want to fit the camera. But with this, you kind of get this for free. This is all just remapped so nicely, and now you're not having to worry about blowing these things out. ACES is handling this. The tone mapping of ACES is handling the super bright highlights for you. So up to this point, I've sort of avoided the topic of converting textures and images into ACES color space in order to render those out. So what I think I'm going to do is split this off into two tutorials where I go over an actual true ACES workflow, converting HDRI dome lights, textures, images into ACES, and then rendering them out, along with a project where I go over comping ACEScg over live action footage. That tutorial should be out now, and I should have a link to that in the description below, along with all the other ACES resources and other tutorials and downloads. I know this is a pretty complicated topic, and I hope I've covered everything in a way that was understandable. But as always, if there are any questions about this or concerns, please leave a comment and let me know or ask away. I'll be monitoring those pretty closely. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks, everybody.